This video looks at another Merlin Excel report building rule, in particular where to place the member labels in relation to the report header. Report headers are the cells on the same row or column as the Merlin Excel corner keyword. In this example they've been shaded grey. When entering member labels, the first member label must be entered in one of the header cells. And the member labels for the row headers can be typed in the same column as the Merlin Excel corner keyword. And similarly for the column headers, the first member label for a column of data must start in the report header cell. And when the data is refreshed, data is placed at the intersection of the row and column headers. If the member label isn't placed in the first column header, when the data is refreshed, the column is ignored and no data is retrieved for that column. And the same thing would happen if we were to move the row header label and then re-refresh. So if the first cell in the row header or column header are blank, then the row or column is ignored when the data is refreshed. So when building your Merlin Excel reports, it's important to identify the row header cells and the column header cells, and often shading these cells can be helpful. But it's important to point out at this stage that data is not retrieved into the first two rows or columns of your retrieval range. So when building your Merlin report range, don't place your first member label next to the Merlin Excel corner cell, because you'll find when you refresh the worksheet, no data is retrieved into the intersecting cells. In fact, it's recommended that you leave a gap of at least 7 or 8 rows and columns from the corner cell before entering the first member label. As we'll see later, this will allow space for keywords such as descriptions and other useful formatting functions. So when building your Merlin Excel report, give yourself plenty of space in the top left-hand corner. When it comes to specifying multiple dimensions for your row and column headers, place the member labels in adjacent cells without leaving any spaces between the cells. In this example, the column of data is set to Jan from the period dimension. If we also wanted to specify a year from the year dimension, we select the cell immediately under the report header cell in the same column and enter the member label. To enter a member from a third dimension, for example actual from the scenario dimension, we place that in the cell underneath, making sure that the member labels are in adjacent cells with no blank cells in between. I'll just set up some rows to display these member descriptions so that when we refresh the worksheet, we can clearly see the 3 dimensions specified in this column. Let's add a second column, but this time I'm going to leave a blank cell in the middle of the column header labels to demonstrate what effect the blank cell has when we refresh the data. And we can see now, once we've refreshed the data, that the second column is different from the first column because the space in row 6 means that the year and scenario members in column K are not being picked up, so are taken from the background point of view. If we drag the year member label up so that it is now in a cell next to the first member label, the year 2020 becomes part of the column header point of view. The scenario member label, however, because there's still a blank space, is not part of the column header, and when we refresh the worksheet, this time the data in both columns is the same because the budget member label in column K is being ignored and does not form part of the column headers due to the space. Therefore, the scenario member for column K is taken from the background point of view, not from the cell in column K. If we were to close the gap and remove the space and refresh the data again, this time the budget member label cell is attached to the column header and therefore the data is updated accordingly. Let's now demonstrate that with the row headers. In this example report, row 15 has 2 member labels, an account and a member from the entity dimension. But in row 16, the space in column D means that the member label in column E is ignored and does not form part of the point of view for row 16. Therefore, the entity member is taken from the background point of view. So the entity member in row 16 is not fixed and will change when the entity in the background point of view changes. So take care when building your Merlin Excel reports that you don't leave any blank spaces in the row and column headers. This will ensure you display the intended data. So far, we have only looked at how to place a single member label in a cell, but it is possible to combine multiple member labels in the same cell if you separate them with a semicolon. In the last example report, we had 3 separate member labels in 3 separate cells. But we would get the same results by typing the same member labels into the first header row, separating the member labels with a semicolon and no spaces. And you can also combine the different approaches. You can have some header cells with multiple member labels, and so long as they're in adjacent cells with no spaces, you can combine them with header cells with single member labels. So it's up to you how you choose to construct your row and column headers. And from a data point of view, the order in which the dimension labels are added does not matter. The data retrieved will be exactly the same. However, the member descriptions are displayed in the order in which they appear in the header. We've seen in the previous examples that it is important not to have a blank cell in the middle of the POV range, indicating the column or row header. That's because when Merlin Excel reaches a blank cell, it stops evaluating the point of view and moves on to the next row or column. So it is very important that a blank cell does exist to distinguish between the end of the point of view and the beginning of the data retrieval range. In this example report, we can see that we have some blank rows separating the column header point of view from the cells in which the data is retrieved. And in column F, we have blank cells separating the row headers from where the data is retrieved into column G. If we were to delete this blank column F, there is now no blank cell to separate the end of the row header from the area where the data is retrieved. So when Merlin Excel comes to evaluate the row header for row 15, it takes all the cells joined to the first row header from cells C15 to G15. But the contents of cells F and G15 are not member labels, but descriptions brought in from a previous refresh. So this time when refreshing the worksheet, instead of displaying data, it's displaying an error message indicating that it does not recognize the member label that it's found as part of the header. And that's why you need to have a blank cell to indicate the end of the range of cells specifying the row or column header. And finally in this section, I'll just clear the data to show you a circumstance to be aware of. In this example report, we've defined a row header consisting of 3 separate member labels in 3 separate columns, and we have a blank cell at the end indicating the end of the row header. When we refresh the data, the correct data and descriptions are brought into the intersecting cells. But we didn't leave enough of a gap between the end of the row headers and where the descriptions are brought in column F. So this time when we refresh the data, we get the unknown label error again, because the member descriptions have been brought in and added to cells that append it to the row header. So to correct this, we need to insert at least one blank column to separate the end of the row headers from the description cells. And this time when we refresh the worksheet, the row headers can be correctly determined. The next Merlin Excel report building rule we're going to look at is the rule that says that a dimension can only be referenced in either the row or the column header, but not in both at the same time. In this example, we have a member from the account dimension in the row header and a member from the period dimension in the column header. If we were to now add a member from the period dimension into the row header and refresh the worksheet, we see that the intersecting cell of the 2 period dimension members returns an error message of a dimension conflict. And likewise, if we were to have two account members in opposing row and column headers, then the intersecting cell would also return a dimension conflict and identifying a hash as the account dimension being in conflict. The next rule is hopefully already very clear, and that is that for each intersecting cell, a dimension that is not specified in the row or column header is taken from the background point of view. In this example report, we can see that column J is pulling data from the budget scenario, whereas column K does not specify a specific scenario member. Column K therefore displays data for whatever scenario is currently selected in the background point of view, in this case actual. Unlike with HFM web forms, when a dimension member has been specified, it does not apply to all subsequent columns or rows in the report. Specifying the budget scenario member for column J applies only to column J, and all other columns, a starting point is the background point of view. If we change the scenario member in the background point of view, the data will update accordingly. But note that the description of the currently selected background point of view of the scenario member is not displayed in the report anywhere. So if we wanted to include the description of the currently selected scenario member, we could enter into the header cell the Excel formula equals scenario, or better still, the formula scenario_ref. The Excel formula with the suffix _ref is available for all dimension names. The Excel formula with the dimension and suffix _ref will add the dimension identifier, in this case S hash, to the front of the member label, and this is best practice in case there are duplicate member labels across different dimensions. Using the formula to display the currently selected member label will ensure that the member description is displayed in the descriptions rows, making the report look neater, and at the same time allowing you to use the POV panel to control the content of the report headers. So far in the reports we've looked at, a dimension has been specified in either the row header, column header or background point of view. But there is a fourth place where the dimensions can be specified, and that is in the corner cell of the report. There may be times, particularly if you have multiple retrieval ranges, when you want to fix the point of view of one of the ranges. And to do this, you would append to the end of the Merlin Excel keyword the fixed partial point of view to apply to this range. However, if you do hard code the point of view into the corner cell, you should consider typing in the descriptions of that point of view into the report to avoid any confusion as to the point of view of the retrieval range, because Merlin Excel will not automatically display those member descriptions if they are specified in the corner cell. Another rule worth mentioning is that member labels and dimension identifiers are not case sensitive. And just to confirm something mentioned earlier, that a dimension identifier, such as a hash to indicate the account dimension, is recommended although not required. It is only required when there are duplicate member labels. That is, member labels that exist in more than one dimension. In this report, the row header consists of a single row with the member label 6, which corresponds to the account revenue. The member label 6 only appears in the account dimension, so there's no problem typing in just 6 in the report, and Merlin will work out which dimension the member label 6 comes from. But adding the member label none without a dimension identifier will return the error message unknown label. Likewise, if we were to add the member label USD or GBP into the report header, we would again see the error message unknown label. That's because the none member is a member label that appears in more than one dimension. It appears in every custom, the account and the entity dimension, and the value members GBP and USD are also included in custom 1, custom 2 for collecting the exchange rates. So for duplicate member labels, you do need to prefix the member label with the dimension identifier. which is the short dimension name followed by a hash or pound sign. But if you wish, you can also use the dimension long name. Both will work. The none member label and the currencies are examples of duplicate member labels on all HFM applications. Your application may have additional member labels that are duplicated across all other dimensions. That's why it's recommended to always prefix the member label with a dimension identifier, just to remove any possible confusion.